If you could find a seat, we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. So for you students, I hope you enjoyed your first couple days of school. I hope those were enjoyable and you didn't have to go out in the snow. My name is Matthew. I'm the president of Rochelle Christi. It's good to have you guys. Yeah, and we're on campus this semester. So that's another plus for you students. And for anyone who's watching online, welcome as well. So a couple announcements. Let's see, so we'll be meeting here every Wednesday at 7:30. And we'll be eating beforehand at 6, just downstairs, if you would like to join us. Also, if you're interested in apologetics, Adam is teaching a class on that subject. And if you're interested, then you can talk to Adam. So our theme for this semester is win some conversations when you disagree. So how to have those conversations in public or with people who have very different thoughts on the world and how it should be, and how to properly go about talking and discussing, and ultimately having good conversations. So for today, what we're going to do is have a guest speaker. We'll be going over for the next few weeks. We'll be having students, bring a topic up and yeah, do their own discussion. And tonight we will have Joel Mormon on Does God Exist? Without further ado, give it up for Joel.
Rochelle Christi. I'm excited to be back this semester for this theme, win some conversations when you disagree. So I guess when you agree, all bets are off and you can be as mean as you want. But when you disagree, that's when, anyway. Okay, I'm sure how to advance the slides. Is the microphone on, Wesley? I think it is. Yes? Okay. All right, so thanks for bearing with the logistics here. First time in this room, obviously, and so we're kind of figuring out how things go. Yeah, as Matt said the topic, but it's Does God Exist? That's kind of the topic for tonight. Doing an apologetics review of some basic, standard questions that are asked in the realm of apologetics, and kind of doing a review for those of you who have heard about these topics before. And if it's new to you, then you'll learn some new information about different aspects of apologetics and how to defend the Christian faith. Starting with one of the most basic questions, and that's, does God exist? Because if God does not exist, then all bets are off, right? The Bible's not true, Jesus isn't God, right? Didn't probably rise from the dead. But if God exists, then all that stuff is at least possible, right? Got to look at the evidence then. So we'll start with this foundational question that people have asked for centuries and millennia, and we'll see, what does the evidence say? So Bertrand Russell was a famous atheist back around kind of the turn of the century and on into the first half of the 20th century. And he said this one time. He said, many Orthodox or read Christian people speak as though it were the business of skeptics to disprove received dogmas rather than of dogmatists or read Christians to prove them. This is, of course, a mistake. If I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars there is a china teapot revolving around the sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion. But if I were to go on to say that since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is intolerable presumption to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. And what he's doing is attacking the idea of believing in God, kind of comparing it to believing there's a china teapot revolving around the sun in elliptical orbit. And while I don't quite think that analogy would really line up, believing in God is not analogous to a china teapot orbiting around the sun, we have good reason to believe that that's not the case. But he is making a good point in one respect, and that is that the burden of proof lies on the person making the claim. And so as Christians who believe that God exists, sometimes it might be up to us to give evidence and to give good reasons that why we think he does. Now, I would disagree with Bertrand Russell that you can't just default to atheism, right? The default position is more of an agnosticism, right? I don't know if God exists. He might not. But if you're going to make the claim God does not exist, that's also a claim that requires some evidence and some reasons for it. But I think what Bertrand Russell says is is good that if we're going to make the claim that God does exist, we better know why we think that. So I'm going to start by kind of talking about three main arguments. So if you're new to this style of argumentation for existence of God type topics, I would say focus on these big three arguments, and they're kind of the most celebrated or most popular ones that are often presented because they're easy to understand and they're pretty good. And they would go by these names: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument. And as we get into this talk, I'll explain more what those mean. But if you're new to this, kind of focus on those big three. I'll have some other ones kind of thrown in throughout as kind of bonus material for those of you who are really familiar with these arguments. But that's kind of the roadmap for where we're going to go, although I'm going to kind of go out of order. I'm going to go 3, 1, 2. But anyway, before we get there, I want to talk about something that is sometimes put forward as an argument for God's existence, or more accurately, it's sometimes put forward as a reason or an argument for why you should believe in God, and that's known as Pascal's wager. So before we look at Pascal's wager, who was Pascal? Well, Pascal was a scientist, a mathematician, a philosopher, and even consider him a theologian if you want to, who lived in the early 1700s, and he made a lot of contributions to science and math, actually. A few of those are that he invented the Pascaline, an early mechanical calculator. There it is. So he invented a mechanical calculator like before the Revolutionary War happened. He was a Frenchman, but early 1700s, he's inventing a mechanical calculator. He did a lot with probability theory, hence there's a famous distribution called the Pascal distribution that's named for him. He came up with Pascal's triangle of binomial coefficients. When you take a binomial and you raise it to a power, you get those coefficients on each one of the terms. He came up with that idea, or at least was one of the people to popularize it. There's Pascal's law of the transmission of fluid pressure, so a scientific thing related to Pascal. And the standard unit of pressure, the Pascal, is named for him as well. And he had Pascal's theorem, which says if 6 arbitrary points are chosen on a conic and joined by line segments in any order to form a hexagon, then the 3 pairs of opposite sides of the hexagon meet at 3 points, which lie in a straight line called the Pascal line of the hexagon. I'm sure you all understood that. Here's our visual. You've got your 6 points inside the conic, which is a circle, and then the blue line is your Pascal line. So he somehow came up with that, and it works. So there we go. But the point is, he's a really smart guy, right? He knew math and science and all of that. And so another thing he's known for is this thing called Pascal's wager. What is Pascal's wager? Well, simply put, he said, okay, there's kind of 3 eternal states of existence that are possible, right? You've got heaven, that's possible. Or you've got non-existence, right? So you don't actually go anywhere, you cease to exist. Or you've got hell, right? So Christianity might posit the existence of the top one and the bottom one, and then atheism, the one in the middle. And so Pascal asked these questions, and he said, okay, if I believe in God, and I'm right that God exists, well, then I've got a pretty good chance of going to heaven. He said, but if I believe in God and I'm wrong and God doesn't exist, well, then if atheism's true, I'll just cease to exist, and I won't even know that I was wrong. If I don't believe in God and I'm right, God doesn't exist, well, then I will also end up not existing. And if I'm wrong and God does exist, well, that puts me in hell. And he said, okay, look at these different situations and kind of ask yourself, what are the costs and benefits of these 2 beliefs, right? Or in other words, which belief is riskier? There's a picture of Pascal over there. So he said, if I believe in God, then I'm risking very little, non-existence, but I stand to gain a lot, which is eternal communion with God or eternal happiness in heaven. But if I choose not to believe in God, then I stand to gain very little by being right, non-existence, but I risk a lot, eternal separation from God or suffering in hell. And so, this is his own words. He said, a game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? You must wager. It's not optional. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these 2 chances. If you gain all, and if you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that God exists. So that was kind of Pascal's formulation of this concept of Pascal's wager, and it's kind of a neat little thought experiment to consider for a moment. But then he said some other things in that same book he was writing that said this: let us then examine this point and say God is or he is not, but to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. According to reason, you can defend neither of these propositions, that God exists or that he does not exist. And he said, learn your inability to believe, since reason brings you to this, and yet you cannot believe. Endeavor then to convince yourself, not by the increase of proofs of God, but by the abatement of your passions. This will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. So he kind of has this view that he says, well, you kind of just have to wager because reason isn't going to get you anywhere. It's not going to help you know if God exists, not going to help you know if he doesn't exist, and so you kind of just have to go with your gut or go with what might benefit you in the long run. But we know that Pascal wasn't an enemy of reason, right? He's a scientist, a mathematician, a philosopher, and he used those kind of thinking skills in what he did and the things he discovered. So why did he say that? He said it because of this. He says he's making an observation about human nature, that people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. All our reasoning reduces itself to yielding to feeling. And I don't think I would quite agree that it's that fatal, that everybody just kind of goes with what they desire and doesn't use reason at all. But I think that he is kind of getting at something, that he realizes that it can be hard, that we want to believe what we want to believe, right? There's confirmation bias. There's this feeling that I want to kind of justify what I already want to be true. And so he kind of said, well, if people aren't going to look at the evidence and they aren't going to use reason, then how else can I convince them? Was kind of maybe some of his thought process here. But I would disagree with Pascal that we really can't use reason at all. And in fact, I'm going to hope that this presentation will kind of prove Pascal wrong, at least on this first point, that actually reason can help us to weigh the evidence in favor of or against God's existence. So what do I think is wrong with Pascal's wager? Well, a few things. Like I just said, I think reason can help us examine this evidence. It's not useless. It's not something that just can't help us decide, as Pascal seemed to think. His thought experiment, it's a thought experiment. He probably knew that this was the case, but it's slightly inconsistent with Christian theology, right? You don't enter heaven by simply believing that God exists, right? James, even the demons believe that. Eternal life comes by believing in Jesus Christ. Jesus said, no one comes to the Father but through me. So it's not quite representative. I don't think he was intending that, but sometimes people can get the wrong impression from Pascal's way. You just have to believe in God, and that's not quite the Christian message. Pascal's wager then can't help us decide which God to believe in. You know, should I believe in the Christian God or the Islamic one? At that point, it's kind of a zero-sum game, right? It's two opposite sides, and Pascal's wager really can't help you if you're going to try to wager on that question. And then finally, I think the strongest thing is that you should believe in something because it's true, not because it's going to benefit you in the long run if you believe it, right? I think that's how we should form our beliefs. It's kind of more of a correct epistemology. And, even if, God who existed was just going to say everybody gets the just punishment for their sins and everybody's going to go to hell, well, okay, you wouldn't gain anything, but you should still believe in him if he existed, just because it's true that he does exist. So I think that ultimately we need to believe in the things that are true, not because we'll benefit. But I think Pascal's wager has one very important thing that it does, and it kind of points out that this is an important question, or in other words, the stakes could not be higher, right? You shouldn't, be lazy about this question or forget about it or not think about it. It's an important question to know, does God exist? Because if God exists, then that could lead to a whole bunch of other things that follow from that might be important, one of which could be your eternal destiny. And so at least consider the question to examine the evidence and know with some confidence whether you think that God does exist or he doesn't. But ultimately, when considering these questions, as Pascal pointed out usefully, I think, the stakes cannot be higher. So now I'm going to move on to some actual argumentation, and I'm going to start with kind of a parody of an argument that I call the quote-unquote biblical argument. You'll see why I call it that in a minute, but it kind of goes like this. Okay, here's a biblical argument. Premise one says that whatever the Bible says is true, and already we're doing some heavy lifting to establish that premise here, but just go with me. 2, the Bible says that God exists. That's premise 2. Therefore, God exists. So that's an argument, right? We find it in premise, conclusion form, and we can ask some questions about that argument, such as this. Is this argument valid? And the answer is probably yes, because the conclusion follows logically. It doesn't matter if the premises are true when we're asking, is the argument valid? We're just asking, does the logic work? Do the premises, if both premises are true, do they establish the conclusion? And I would think that in this case, it's a pretty logically airtight argument that yes, if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then premise 3 follows pretty much necessarily. Second, is this argument sound, right? So that's now asking a further question, not is the argument just logical, but do the premises actually hold up? Are they established by evidence? And I would say that 2 is pretty much undeniable. If you just read the book, you'd find that out. Premise number 1 takes a lot of heavy lifting to establish, but for the sake of us who are Christians in this room, most of us, I think, would grant that premise. So for us, the argument would be sound, right? But I think there's a third question to ask, and that's, is the argument convincing? And that can kind of be a subjective question, but no, I would say it's not too convincing because it's kind of hard to defend to somebody who's maybe skeptical. A good argument is going to have premises that somebody who's skeptical might be inclined to accept on the basis of scientific evidence, philosophical reasoning, etc. Premise number one takes a lot of work to defend and to even get somebody to accept premise one. And if somebody did accept premise one, then it's kind of trivial because if they accepted premise one, then duh, they're going to believe that God exists, right? So that's why I said there's kind of these three things to consider with an argument. One, is it logical? Just if we grant the premises, does the logic work? Two, are the premises well supported? And then three, if so, is the argument convincing? I think those are three important questions to kind of ask yourself as we go through each one of these arguments to kind of evaluate where you're at with them. So you might even agree with the conclusion, like I agree with this conclusion, but I don't think it's the best argument if I'm going to try to convince somebody that God does exist. So like I said, that was kind of a caricature or a parody. It wasn't actually a serious attempt at an argument. Now we'll get into some real arguments. So the first argument I said I'd cover is the moral argument. And I put this one first because we did a lot of stuff with morality last semester. For those of you, I think most of you were here at least once last semester. And so the moral argument for God's existence goes something like this. Premise number one, objective moral values and duties exist. Premise number two, if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. Or an abductive way to word that would be something like God is the best explanation for moral values and duties. So I'll usually try to provide a structure that is logically airtight, and then I'll put in parentheses kind of an abductive version, which is also, I think, valid. Abductive just means reasoning to the best explanation or inference to the best explanation. So there's some ways that these arguments can be considered in that light. But so I'm going to kind of have two alternate formulations of that. And so then, therefore, God exists, right? Objective moral values and duties exist. If God did not exist, then they wouldn't. So therefore, God exists. That's kind of the structure of the moral argument. And for the defense of these premises, premise number one was the subject of the debate that Will and I had with Matt and Ethan last semester, kind of in early November, as to whether objective moral values and duties really do exist. And premise two was kind of the subject of the discussion that Adam and Eric Wielenberg had back in September, I think. So we've actually done a lot of work in defending these ideas already. So I'm going to ask every teacher's favorite question, and that's, assuming you think this is a good argument, based on last semester, how would you defend premises one and two? And so at Rochelle Christie, we do like discussion groups where we kind of get into with people around us, and I know the chairs aren't that conducive to that. So if we're willing to do discussion groups, kind of turn around to people close to you and give it 3 minutes to say, how would you support premises one and two if you were to try to do so? Go. some point, I've got a bunch of arguments to go through yet, so, and more discussion time. So I'll bring everybody kind of back in, and we'll continue on down the line. All right. This is not even loaded. Okay, so if I were going to defend the moral argument in a nutshell, and I'll kind of fly through this quickly because, like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because there's a lot of time last semester spent on this one. I would do it like this. So do objective moral values and duties exist? Here's some considerations. One, our intuition seems to tell us that they do. Is that reliable? Well, the principle of impartiality cannot cover all situations, and what I mean by that is we kind of seem to feel that moral situations are different than situations where our preferences are involved. Like, should I or should I not go eat at a Mexican restaurant or a Chinese restaurant or at the Oven downtown, which one of those should I do versus, should I shoot this dog with a BB gun repeatedly just because I have a morbid type of fun doing that. There's kind of this difference between situations that have a moral dimension and situations that don't, that are just merely based on preferences. Our moral experience, like our sense experience, indicates that objective moral values and duties exist. So in order to doubt that, we need an incredibly compelling objection to do so. You can almost kind of parallel the arguments. How do I know that my senses are giving me a reliable picture of the world? Well, it seems like they do, and it's kind of hard to doubt that. And you can kind of make parallel arguments for our sense of moral values and duties as well. The acceptance of moral values and duties is widely held throughout many human cultures at many different times and places. There's obviously some disagreements, but there seems to be kind of these broad currents of agreement. Things like we should respect authority and different other principles, which respect life, human life, not murder, things like that. So there are some broad commonalities that seem to be universal. Many academic philosophers who are not Christians also believe the evidence for objective moral values and duties is compelling. I just think that's kind of a thing to throw in, not really an argument from authority that because they think it, then it's correct, but more just kind of it's evidence that there's people who have thought about these questions very deeply, who are not Christians and don't accept the assumption that God exists, but who still find the evidence for objective morals existing to be compelling. And then finally, I think the alternative, subjectivism, has flaws. One of the big ones is that there can really be no moral critique or disagreement. All moral opinions are equally valid under a subjectivist framework, and so there's really no way you can say, well, you're wrong, or what you're doing is wrong, or you're, et cetera. There's really no way to make those kind of claims in a subjectivist paradigm. So, and then the second premise is God the best explanation for morality. A couple points for that. One, a moral law seems to require a moral lawgiver, right? If you have some kind of rules or obligations, they seem to require some kind of a personal source. To whom are we actually obligated? Who holds us morally accountable? A theory of objective moral values without some kind of a personal being to hold us accountable kind of seems like it might be lacking something in some sense. The explanation for objective values without God lacks a relational or personal context. It's kind of similar to the previous point. And then defense at this point can usually be made by examining other proposals for how objective moral values could exist, put forward by people who don't believe in God, and then seeing how those hold up in comparison to Christianity. We did that a lot with Adam's content last semester, but he always likes to talk about Eric Wielenberg's theory, and there are two objections that he put forward for that one. One, that Eric Wielenberg's theory for how to have objective moral values without God posits a lot of ontological, which just means things that exist, right? Entities that might not be the simplest explanation. Having a singular being, God, to explain morality is better than a bunch of abstract facts that just kind of exist out in the void. And then second, the lucky coincidence objection. If there are these moral values kind of out there that are objective, then how in the world did human beings come to know them and actually have our moral beliefs be in tune with those? Is it kind of lucky that if evolution is true, that we evolved to a state where we just happen to have the correct moral beliefs? So that's kind of a, in a nutshell, defense of the moral argument. And so if we have established the premises of the moral argument, then the conclusion follows. If objective moral values and duties exist, and if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist, well then therefore, logically, God has to exist. So there's kind of a summary of the moral argument, and that's kind of how we're going to run through all these arguments. We're going to present the form of the argument, try to defend the premises as best we could in kind of our short time here together, and then look at what the conclusion results from that. So, okay, so our next section will be cosmological arguments, and notice the plural, because cosmological, although there's often an argument called the cosmological argument, cosmological arguments is more kind of a category or a type of argument, to which there are several. The most famous one is often just called the cosmological argument, and that's what we'll look at first, and that is the Kalam cosmological argument. It's actually an argument for God's existence that came out of Islamic circles at first, so not Christian ones, but actually it was Islamic philosophers who used this argument to argue that their God existed. So it was actually first pioneered by a guy named Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Tusi al-Ghazali. Sorry, that's quite a name, so we're just going to refer to him as al-Ghazali. But then he lived back around the 1000s. So in modern times, this argument was kind of revived by a philosopher named William Lane Craig back in the 70s. He kind of, I think, did some of his doctoral work on this argument and really repopularized it for use in the Western world. And you'll notice that al-Ghazali has a really great beard in this drawing, and William Lane Craig does not. But he did have one at one time when he resurrected this argument back in the 70s. He looked like that. So yeah, he had a pretty great beard, actually. And as you can see, there's kind of a movement to bring back the beard. Somebody reached out to him over Facebook Messenger and said, "Can Bill please grow his beard out?" And Bill responded, "Could but won't," sadly. And then he addressed this on the Reasonable Faith podcast as well, where he said, "I do not understand this, frankly. The fact is that if I were to grow my beard back, it would come in gray or white. I would look even older than I look now. I just have no desire to look like an old man with a white beard going around, and I don't want to dye it. I don't want to color it, so I'm not going to do this." So he seems resolutely opposed to this, but Photoshop evidence suggests he might actually look pretty good with a beard if you were to grow it out today. There is a movement, the group in support of the resurrection of William Lane Craig's beard on Facebook, 851 members, so if you support this cause, this is the group for you. Okay, now for the actual argument. Yeah, all right. That had to find its way in here once I found that Facebook group, it just had to. Okay. The first premise of the cosmological argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, premise 2. Well, therefore, the universe must have a cause. And then we can kind of speculate, okay, well, what might this cause be if the universe has a cause, right? But sometimes you'll hear this argument referred to like the uncaused cause or the unmoved mover. It's kind of a similar way to refer to this argument. So does everything have a cause? Premise 1, well, no, actually. The premise does not say that. If you read it closely, everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that kind of helps us avoid the, well, what caused God objection, because we argue that he is the uncaused cause, or the final stopping point that has to exist if you're not going to have an infinite regress of causes. So something cannot come from nothing. Seems pretty well established, right? This has never been observed. You know, why don't we see other things coming into existence from nothing? We don't seem to observe that on a daily basis. Science doesn't observe things popping into existence from nothing. And as William Lane Craig says, if this were true, it would be worse than magic. So it's just kind of a fundamental, you know, the law of causality, as this is sometimes known, is that you kind of have to have this to have any kind of a sensible explanation of the world. And so, like I said, it's kind of the basis of all scientific discovery. We look for causes and explanations of the things that we observe. And I think one kind of interesting little example of this is the triumph of the French scientist Louis Pasteur over the idea of spontaneous generation, which there were actually some scientists in his day who believed that microbes kind of arose spontaneously instead of actually coming from a prior source. They just kind of generated from a life force, quote unquote. And Pasteur kind of devised this ingenious experiment to kind of say, hey, do they spontaneously form or do they not? And so he kind of sterilized a broth in this swan neck flask, it's called, to kill off all the microbes. And he left one that was not exposed to air, and then he broke off the neck of one so that it was exposed to air. And then what did he find? Well, the one that was not exposed to air had no microbes living in it after a few days. Well, the one that was did. He concluded, therefore, the microbes that must have started up in that one were not spontaneously generated out of nothing. They were from the air. They were airborne microbes that populated the water he had left on the counter. And so this experiment kind of marks this interesting little, somewhat symbolic turning point in the fact that we don't have scientific theories that account for things just popping into existence out of nothing. It's just not something that we admit that can happen usually. So did the universe begin to exist? This is usually the more controversial premise, or how these words are defined. And there are kind of 4 basic pieces of evidence to support this premise. There's 2 philosophical ones. An actual infinity cannot exist. 2, time cannot be past infinite. And then there's 2 pieces of scientific evidence that are often put forward, and they are entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, and the fact that the universe is expanding. We'll go through each one of these and kind of present an interesting little argument for each one that kind of establishes that based on any one of these 4 pieces of evidence that the universe did in fact begin to exist, and we have reasons to believe that. So first, we can look at one of William Lane Craig's favorite defenses of this actual infinity concept, and that's Hilbert's paradox of the Grand Hotel. A mathematician named David Hilbert came up with this, and he said, okay, can a hotel have infinite rooms? Can an actual infinity exist in reality? And he said, well, if a guest wants to check into an infinite room hotel that has no vacancy, it's still possible. Simply move the guest from room 1 into room 2, and then from room 2 into room 3, and so on. It might annoy them considerably, but you can do it. And then put the new guest into the empty room 1, and now you've accommodated a new guest, even though you had no vacancy before, and you can keep doing it again and again and again and again, such that if an infinite number of guests wants to check in, and you have no vacancy in an infinite room hotel, it's also possible. Move the guests from room 1 into room 2, and room 2 into room 4, and room 3 into room 6, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You will have vacated all the odd numbered rooms. There's an infinite number of odd numbers, and so all the infinite guests can now check into the odd numbered rooms with no problem, and you've now accommodated an infinite number of new guests, all while having no vacancy. And so you kind of reach this weird paradox that violates the pigeonhole principle, because it says that there is a guest in every room, but simultaneously more guests can be accommodated. So it's kind of a little fun thought experiment type way to understand that an actual infinite can exist. How does this apply to the Kalam cosmological argument? Well, if time has existed or has run from eternity past, there had to be an infinite number of moments of time, which this argument would say actually an actual infinite of actual things cannot exist, including moments of time. So, but if you don't believe that, we can look at the fact that time cannot actually have been past infinite because of a thing called the Grim Reaper paradox. This is put forward by a philosophy professor named Robert Coons. He actually spoke here in that room right across the hall 2 years ago. And if we succeed in getting William Lane Craig to grow out his beard, we'll start on Robert Coons next. He puts forward this paradox. So he says, time must be bounded in the past. An infinite regress of moments of time produces a paradox. And what does he mean? Well, we have Fred here. Fred's a stick figure who lives in a two-dimensional world. And he lives on this axis of time. And this axis of time is past infinite, so we have moment t, t minus 1, t minus 2, et cetera, and it goes on into the past forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Unfortunately for Fred, there's a Grim Reaper standing right there who will kill Fred if he survives to that point in time. And Fred also has a lot of bad luck because there's one there and there and there and there and there. And the point is that if Fred survives long enough to reach one of these Grim Reapers, that Grim Reaper will kill Fred and he will not survive any longer. So if we think about Fred having survived to time t, if he survives to time t, that Grim Reaper at t will kill him and he won't survive. But for him to have survived even to time t, he would have had to get past t minus 1, which is impossible because if he would have gotten to t minus 1, that Reaper would have killed him. But that's impossible because if he would have even gotten to t minus 1, he had to have gotten past t minus 2, and if he would have gotten that far, that one would have killed him, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on into the past. So we end up with this paradox that says it's impossible that Fred survives. We know that if he gets all the way through to t, he will die, but it's also impossible that any Grim Reaper will have killed him, because if any one of these actually kills him, that implies that the previous one didn't do their job, and that's impossible in our thought experiment. So it's kind of just a little neat way to demonstrate that time cannot be past infinite. It just doesn't make sense for time to have to just go on forever and ever and ever in the past. If it did, imagine counting up from negative infinity, how would we ever get to the present if time had been infinite in the past? That's kind of what this is demonstrating. So, okay, there's our two pieces of philosophical evidence. Now we'll turn to the two pieces of scientific evidence, and they are as follows. The first one is based on the second law of thermodynamics, or the heat death of the universe. I said that already. Heat naturally flows only from a hot body to a cooler body, and external energy is required to reverse the process. So like, for example, refrigeration requires a bunch of external energy to kind of, suck heat out of a colder area and then expel it into a warmer climate. But naturally, heat never flows from a cold object to a hot object, always from a hot object to a cold object. That kind of directionality is embedded in the universe. Another way to say this is that it's impossible for any process to have as its sole result the transfer of heat from a cooler body to a hotter body. So that arrow up there cannot be reversed. As a result, some energy is rendered unusable. Why? Well, because if you have a hot body and a cold body, the heat will kind of reach a state of equilibrium where everything will then be lukewarm, right? If you've got a glass of cold water and you pour hot water into it and then just let it sit, eventually, the cold water will bring the temperature of the hot water down and the heat will kind of penetrate the cold part of it, and eventually it'll be kind of a room temperature lukewarm state, right? So you will reach this state of equilibrium, And at some point, you cannot reverse this process so that the heat can come, out of a colder thing to reheat itself, if you will, right? So at some point, the universe will also encounter this state of equilibrium. It is theorized. That's known as the universe's heat death or the big freeze, when the universe itself, just like your glass of water sitting on a counter, will reach thermodynamic equilibrium, and there will be no excess heat with which to heat anything because it's all the same temperature. And the question is, if the universe had existed forever, why have we not reached that point already? If we've had infinite time for the universe to reach a state of equilibrium, why have we not reached said state of equilibrium? It's kind of an interesting little consideration, but I think even more convincing is the evidence that comes from the universe's expansion. So, right, the universe is expanding, right? That's kind of known. Hubble Space Telescope showed us that. We saw the redshift of certain planets and stars, and that showed us that the universe was expanding, right? And so all current models of the universe show that it must be expanding. There's this thing called the cosmological constant, which describes the speed or the rate of that expansion. But if you consider a universe is slowly expanding, well, what if we run the clock backwards? The universe has to suddenly contract and contract and contract and contract, and then we hit a point in the past where the universe is basically contracted to a single point. If we can run the process in reverse with no changes, right, then at some point we have to kind of hit a single point. And the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, three scientists whose names were unironically Born, Guth, and Vilenkin, came up with a way to kind of show that there had to be a past space-time boundary. Well, how did they do that? Well, this is a quote from Alexander Vilenkin when he says, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Why? Well, Einstein's theory of special relativity kind of plays in a little bit here. There's two postulates to the theory of relativity. One is kind of at a basic level. There's more embedded in this first postulate, but for our sake, all motion is relative. And there's no absolute starting point where motion can just be measured from. You always have to choose a reference point and measure motion from there. So for example, with reference to this floor, I'm not moving right now, but with reference to the sun, I actually am moving along with the earth, right? So you always have to choose a reference point. Second of all, and more importantly, the speed of light is constant no matter how it is measured and no matter how fast its source is moving. That was kind of one of the big things, is that if the speed of light is constant, that has some interesting consequences, one of which from the theory of relativity is that time can actually be variable, or time can go slower as you move faster. But keep in mind this idea of the speed of light being kind of this universal speed limit. So what did Born, Guth, and Vilenkin do? Well, the statement of the theorem says any universe that has, on average, been expanding throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. High-level description of it. How did they get here? Well, we have Earth, right? And Earth is sitting in a universe that is expanding kind of away from Earth at, let's just say, 20,000 kilometers per second. And we have a spaceship that's going to be flying past Earth at 100,000 kilometers per second, which that's just, that's just really fast. And I wouldn't even see it, but let's just say we see it, and we observe that it's moving at 100,000 kilometers per second. And it's traveling towards a distant galaxy. Let's just say that galaxy is Andromeda. And it's trying to get there with a universe that is expanding. So actually space is expanding as this spaceship is moving in space. And so by the time this spaceship gets to Andromeda, they're going to observe its motion at 80,000 kilometers per second. The spaceship didn't really change its speed. It's moving at a state of inertia. It's just kind of constantly moving along. But because it's trying to move in a space that is actually expanding underneath it, so to speak, Andromeda will observe that at 80,000 kilometers per second. 100,000 minus the expansion gets us at Andromeda. Now we're kind of making a few assumptions here, but try to simplify it a little bit. So basically, as this spaceship moves into the future, each successive observer of the spaceship will observe it going slower and slower and slower, even though it is in a state of inertia. It's not actually changing, well, you can't really say it's changing speed because everything is relative. But anyway, now if we consider this clock wound back into the past, and let's say we consider what happened with this spaceship when it was approaching a previous galaxy before it even got to Earth, they would have observed it at, again, given some proper assumptions here, 120,000 kilometers per second, or 100,000, which is what we observed it at, plus 20,000, the expansion, and 120,000 kilometers per second. So you can see, as we run the clock forward, this spaceship, to each successive observer, appears to be slowing down. But if we rewind the clock and run it back into the past, this spaceship seems to be speeding up for every previous observer that it has encountered, such that it will get faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, and faster until we hit the universal speed limit, which is the speed of light. It cannot go any faster, and so hence, we can conclude from that, as Borg, Guth, and Vilenkin did, that the universe must have had a past space-time beginning, because there simply is no way that it could have been observed to be going faster than the speed of light, and yet the expansion of the universe implies that it must have, if we run the clock back, have been going that fast at some point in the past and couldn't have exceeded that. Okay, there's kind of the universe is expanding, therefore it had a beginning. And that's accepted in, like I said, the major models of cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, accepts that the universe did have a beginning. So, but what about quantum cosmology? It's kind of one of the objections you see put forward to this. You know, perhaps quantum mechanics and all the random fluctuations that happen in the quantum field, that those things might cast some doubt on whether the universe actually had a beginning, as we might say, or did the universe come from nothing, right? Well, a couple considerations I might point out. Aren't all bets off, like I just said, if we consider the quantum vacuum existed prior to the beginning of the universe. And there's a guy named Stephen Meyer. He's actually coming out with a book this March. That's what it's called, Return of the God Hypothesis, where he kind of puts forward some interesting explanations for this. And he says, consider a few things like this. First, the quantum vacuum is not nothing, right? So that's what caused the quantum vacuum in the first place. If we get back to a point where there's still something that exists, right, well then, by the first premise that we've kind of tried to establish, then it must have a cause, right? So the quantum vacuum is not nothing. You can kind of get into these wranglings about what do you mean by nothing, but we'll kind of sidestep those for a minute. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation is an equation in quantum mechanics that kind of describes the collapse of a wave function to produce a universe. And it must have existed prior to the universe, right, it gave rise to, and must have had a boundary value specified by something outside the universe. As like it's a differential equation, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation is, and differential equations usually have to have some sort of initial condition or boundary condition, and they are an equation. So for these things to have existed prior to the start of everything existing, you kind of have these preconditions. Someone has to set the boundary conditions, or something has to set the boundary conditions. What was that thing? Because otherwise, you know, you can't have the wave function collapse or actually be solvable in any kind of domain. And then thirdly, if the Copenhagen interpretation is correct, then to witness a quantum effect, you have to have an observer. Otherwise, a wave function would never collapse in the quantum state. But since quantum cosmology posits that the universe arose from the collapse of a wave function, then what causes the wave function to collapse and assume a specific value in the first place? An observation has to be made to even get the effect, and if the effect is the universe, then what kind of an observer could cause that effect? Well, it could maybe postulate that perhaps a cosmic observer might have caused the wave function to collapse if the Copenhagen interpretation is correct. Again, there's a lot more that could be said, a lot more expertise than I have. I'm no expert in quantum cosmology, but I'm kind of just giving a few thoughts that have been posited on this objection that usually relies on some form of, well, doesn't quantum cosmology kind of throw all this out the window? I don't think it does, but there's a little bit of a dipping our toe into those waters, if you will. So, to restate the quantum cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think we've established that. The universe began to exist. That is, I think, the scientific consensus at the time. Therefore, the universe has to have a cause. So we've reached discussion question number 2. Which piece of evidence for these premises do you think is the most convincing, and why? Remember, we had, if I rewind all the way back, we had the 2 philosophical ones and the 2 scientific ones, right? It's just kind of a, which of those do you think might be the most powerful argument for supporting the second premise? Go. That's been about 3 minutes, and like I said, we've covered 2 out of more. So let's kind of bring it back here. Like I said, that's the Kalam cosmological argument in a nutshell. There's a different type of cosmological argument that's known as the, we still got more on the Kalam. Forgot about this part. Okay, so the universe has a cause. We've established that with the Kalam cosmological argument. What can we get from this fact? Well, if the universe has a cause, then that cause conceivably must be outside the natural universe, which we can kind of consider the natural universe to be space, time, and matter, right? Those are kind of 3 things that are subsisting within the universe. So we can reasonably infer that cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. In other words, supernatural, or beyond the universe, beyond nature, beyond outside of the universe itself, because the universe, you can't have a cause within itself, right? And so therefore, we can kind of infer from our universe as a cause, by the nature of what the universe is, that that cause must be a supernatural cause, or maybe even God. In addition, by process of elimination, we can kind of get that cause must be personal and powerful, or some kind of a creative agent, right? Powerful because you create something like the universe, but personal because there's really only a few things that could conceivably cause something, or could be in this position outside the universe, abstract objects, or some kind of a being, a supernatural being. And since abstract objects can't cause anything, we're kind of left with some kind of a supernatural being. Abstract objects, by the way, are just kind of like facts or different things that might exist, like the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 might be an abstract object that really can't cause anything to come into being. So we kind of surmise that it was probably some kind of a supernatural being, therefore with personal qualities. Okay, so there's kind of what follows on from our simple, premise conclusion form before. These are some things that can be reasonably inferred from the universe having a cause. Okay, now another type of cosmological argument is known as the contingency argument. This is kind of one of those bonus material things I talked about at the beginning. How does the contingency argument go? Well, it goes like this. It's kind of similar. There's Leibniz, right? Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. That's premise 1. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists. We know that one. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence, and therefore, the explanation of the universe existence is God, by premise 2. And I'm not going to spend much time here, like it's kind of one of those bonus material, a different type of cosmological argument, but I think, therefore God exists, kind of important. All right, so does everything have an explanation? And I think this guy named Bruce Gordon kind of gives a really long quote that kind of summarizes it well, and he says this: "It is not hard to see why this principle has to be true. What would happen to our knowledge of reality if we were to suppose that some contingent states of affairs, i.e. something that exists in this world, had no explanation? Briefly, if some states of affairs could lack explanation, the possibility of there being no explanation would become a competing quote-unquote explanation for anything that occurred. If something can lack explanation, we are prevented from separating things that have an explanation from those that do not. There is no basis to conclude that something having an explanation was not in fact something occurring for no reason at all. Since no objective probability is assignable when there is no explanation, there being no explanation becomes an inscrutable competitor to every proposed explanation, undermining our ability to decide whether anything has an explanation, scientific or otherwise. This means our current state of awareness might also lack explanation, irremediably severing our perceptions from reality. So denying that every contingent state of affairs has an explanation undermines scientific access to truth and opens the door to an irremediable universal skepticism." I think that's just kind of the best. In a nutshell, he uses a lot of big words, as evidenced by the fact that I was trying to read them off and pronounce them in front of everybody. But I'm going to kind of shelve this for now, the defense of the first premise, until a little bit later. Must the explanation be God? Well, we can kind of think about, what, again, Bruce Gordon, what is contingent cannot ultimately be explained by another contingent thing. For infinite regresses of contingent explanations, were such possible, would themselves be contingent and thus both need to have an explanation. So ultimate explanations must terminate upon something that is not contingent, i.e. necessary, and this necessary explanation is what we're proposing is who God is. This argument does not depend on whether the universe began to exist. Note the contingency argument. It only requires that the universe does exist, and that things that exist contingently have explanations. If we are wrong that the universe had a beginning, we can still posit God as the explanation for a contingent universe, even, kind of if you do some work on this, even if it might be past eternal, which is kind of interesting. This might not be compatible with the God of the Bible if we have a past eternal universe, because that kind of might be strange, but regardless, God could still exist, or a supreme being could still exist, even if the universe were past eternal, as long as it is not necessary itself. I mean, it's likely that the universe is not necessary because of the nature of its specificity. I'm also going to table that comment until a little bit later when we talk about fine-tuning. So that's kind of in the nutshell. All right. Our silly song is going to be, does anybody have a maximally great water buffalo? Also known as the ontological argument. Notice the slide backgrounds have changed to blue. This is kind of, again, bonus content. We're going to fly through it, have fun if you want, but don't worry, it's not one of the main points of the lecture. Okay, I just find it really interesting. So what's the ontological argument? Well, Anselm of Canterbury, who lived around the same time as Al-Ghazali did, actually, pioneered the use of this argument. That's Anselm of Canterbury. He had one heck of a beer, which means he was really, really smart. The ontological argument's a big idea, no offense to Phil Vischer, is this. If it is possible that a being such as God exists, then God exists. That's kind of the big idea. How can that be possible? Well, we'll see. By the way, did I get the big idea joke? Phil Vischer is the creator of VeggieTales. VeggieTales was produced by Big Idea Productions. Really hidden. Okay, anyway, sorry. Here's how he said. He said, okay, well, God is the greatest conceivable or imaginable being that we can think of, right? That's how he said. And he said, God exists as an idea in the mind, so it's possible that God exists. A being that exists in reality is, all other things being equal, greater than a being that only exists as an idea in the mind. Therefore, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something greater than God. And if we can imagine greater than God, that produces a contradiction because God is the greatest imaginable being, and so nothing greater than God can be imagined. So therefore, we've produced a contradiction by thinking that God is only an idea in the mind, and therefore, God exists in reality. Now, this argument has met a number of criticisms over the years, one of which being Immanuel Kant saying that existence really isn't like a property, or existence isn't a predicate of of existing. Sorry, that was circular and non. Let me start over with that explanation. Existence is not a predicate, so it's not a property of a thing. You can't say, well, this thing is greater because it exists, right? You can't kind of make some kind of a comparison like that. Most people attack this argument based on premise 3, a being that exists in reality is, all other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. That's kind of usually where most of the criticism comes. Another attack of this argument is that it might be parodyable, meaning that you could consider what about the greatest conceivable chicken sandwich, right? So, what's wrong? Well, this is William Lane Craig claiming that there are no successful parodies of the ontological argument. Yeah, but what about a maximally great chicken sandwich, right? Because, okay, well, let's suppose that a maximally great chicken sandwich is a thing that could exist. But if it existed only as an idea in my mind, well, then it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable chicken sandwich because I can imagine a chicken sandwich greater that actually existed. So therefore, a maximally great chicken sandwich must exist. And some people think that that can be a successful parody of the argument. And Craig would disagree. But then, of course, we have the evidence of Chick-fil-A. And I found that on the internet, so, where to go. But Alvin Plantinga, another philosopher, comes to the rescue, actually. And Craig, to be fair to Craig, he actually defends Plantinga's version, not Anselm's original version. There's a really profound quote from Alvin Plantinga. So a short primer on something called modal logic to understand Alvin Plantinga's argument. What's modal logic? Well, existence is something that exists if it exists in this world that we live in, right? So it makes sense. That chair exists in this world, therefore the chair exists, right? I exist in this world, I exist. But possibility, something is possible if it exists in some possible world, or some other possible state of affairs. By world, we just kind of mean another way things could have been. You can think of a lot of ways like this, in another possible world, I might have been a history major and not an electrical engineering major, right? In another possible world, you might have lived in Denver, Colorado. Who knows? But all these different ways that things could have been, different possible timelines, if you will, that's a possible world. So something's possible. It's possible that, Nebraska includes the state of Wyoming as well, but we don't live in that possible world. In some possible world, that's possible that there's one big state called Nebraska, Wyoming. I don't know. But that's not the world we live in. So necessity, something is necessary if it cannot not exist. In other words, it exists in every possible world, like the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 must be true in every possible world, because 2 + 2 = 5 would be incoherent, and that wouldn't be possible to be true in any possible world. It's not possible that 2 + 2 = 5, so therefore 2 + 2 = 4 is a candidate for something that's necessary. Finally, something that's contingent, as we've been kind of using that word a little bit, is something that is not necessary. It's not necessarily true. It exists by virtue of something else, right? So it's not something that needs to be true. It can be possible, or it could exist or not exist, but it's not necessary. Okay, ontological argument 2. Election Boogaloo. All right. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. So basically it's saying its excellence is necessary. It's Plantinga's kind of first definition. It is possible that there is a being that has maximal greatness, so it's possible that God exists, is kind of what we're saying here. It's possible that this being that we've defined here exists, right? So he might exist in our world, he might not, but it's possible he might exist in some world. So thus, a maximally great being exists in some possible world. But since a maximally great being is necessary, by definition 1, since it exists in some possible world, it has to exist in every possible world, right? If it possibly necessarily exists, then it necessarily exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world, which is our world. Therefore, a maximally great being, i.e. God, exists. I kind of think that argument's neat. It might have some problems. Some people put up criticisms of the logic of this argument. Don't have time to go into them, but they're kind of interesting. But I thought I'd say, so what? Well, if the ontological argument is sound, and it may be, then it means that because of who God is, God's mere possibility implies his existence. Thus, the burden of proof for atheists is to prove not that the existence of God is unlikely, but if the ontological argument is true, that it's literally impossible. It kind of ups the burden of proof. You can't just say, well, it's unlikely that God exists. No, if the ontological, you can't even say it, so don't even use it, right? If it's sound, then you have to show that God is literally impossible, because if he's possible, then that implies his existence, a la the ontological argument. But I like this meditation on what it means a little bit more. It's by a guy named Donald Williams, and he says, Anselm's ontological argument is best understood not as an attempt to answer the question whether God exists so much as a meditation on how God exists, a meditation that has implications for the whether question. You see, you and I could exist or not. If I did not exist, the universe would get on just fine and hardly anyone would notice. This is because we get our existence from another. We do not contain it within ourselves. But God exists necessarily because he does not exist from another but from himself. So if you truly understand who God is, you see that he doesn't just happen to exist like us, he exists necessarily. So if you are thinking of him just as a bigger version of us who might exist or who might not, like Zeus or Odin or the infamous flying spaghetti monster, you are not yet thinking of God, right? The maximally great being. If you kind of try to think of what a maximally great being would be like, it's almost kind of mind-blowing in a sense. And that's kind of what Donald Williams thinks is kind of the point, if you will, of what the ontological argument is trying to get us to think about. But wait, modal logic might be of use to us yet. Recall the contingency argument's first premise that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. We can run an interesting little argument with that. It's sometimes called the principle of sufficient reason. How does this go? Alexander Proust, philosopher, he kind of came up with some of this. Let P be any proposition that represents some state of affairs such as X state of affairs exists, right? If P is a contingently true proposition, then it's possible there's a proposition Q that explains P, right? All right. Assume, however, that P has no explanation. Let P star be the proposition that P is true and there is no explanation for P. So P is true and P has no explanation. Since P is contingently true, then P star, which contains P, is also contingently true. By 1, it's possible that P star has an explanation because it's contingently true, which means there's a possible world, modal logic, in which P star has an explanation Q star. Since there's a possible world in which P star has an explanation, then Q star explains all the parts of P star, including P. Right? Recall P star was P is true and P has an explanation. So Q star explaining P star also must explain P. Thus, P has an explanation, Q star, in whatever possible world we're in right now. But since Q star also explains P star in this possible world, P star must be true, and P star says that P has no explanation in this possible world. So we get a nice contradiction that says P both has and lacks an explanation in the same possible world, which means what? Well, thus P does have an explanation, because we assumed for the sake of contradiction that it did not. Therefore, any contingently true state of affairs has an explanation. And there's kind of an interesting, more rigorous support of the first premise of the contingency argument. If you recall, that went like this, right? I kind of highlighted everything that exists, every contingent state of affairs has an explanation of its existence, and we've kind of shown a more rigorous form of a way to demonstrate that. So anyway, that's kind of for fun, if you liked it. So we've now left our silly song time. So, okay. Teleological arguments. We've reached kind of the third prong of the big three that I mentioned at the beginning. Teleological arguments, again, is kind of more of a category of argument. It's like there's different types of arguments. Telos, which is the Greek word this word comes from, means purpose in Greek. So these are arguments that argue that because the world seems to exhibit some sort of purpose, that therefore there might have been a purpose giver or a designer. That's kind of the nature of these arguments. The most famous is the fine-tuning argument. What is the fine-tuning argument? The fine-tuning argument is this. The universe is fine-tuned for life. That's kind of the first premise. 2, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It's kind of saying there's these 3 options and it must be one of these 3, so that's pretty much, that's fairly unobjectionable. 3, the fine-tuning of the universe is not due to physical necessity or chance. So we'll try to demonstrate this, or another way to say this, the best explanation for the universe's fine-tuning is that it was designed, we could suppose, by a supreme being with an intelligent mind. Therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to the design of a supreme being, which we're calling God in this sense. Therefore, God exists. So there's kind of the outline of the fine-tuning argument, and we'll look to mostly defend premises 1 and 3 here. So, is the universe fine-tuned for life is the first thing we have to ask ourselves, and I would say that it is, but I'm going to quote a few scientists who have kind of ventured comments on this topic, and here's what they have said. Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, in his Brief History of Time, made a remark, and he said, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers, these physical constants, seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Now, of course, he's not a Christian. He has an alternate explanation for why that's the case, but he at least recognizes that some of these values do seem to be finely adjusted in order that life can exist. Fred Hoyle, who is a British astronomer, said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces we're speaking about in nature. And then finally, a quote from Richard Feynman, the famous physicist. He said, all good theoretical physicists put this number, he's talking about a certain constant, the fine structure constant, up on their wall and worry about it. Immediately, you would like to know where this number for a coupling comes from, but nobody knows. It's one of the great mysteries of physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding. We know what kind of dance to do experimentally to measure this number very accurately, but we don't know what kind of dance to do on the computer to make this number come out without putting it in secretly. And so this is just kind of a sampling of some famous scientists who I'm kind of using, their expertise, and I'm saying they've at least recognized that there are these numbers that seem to be very finely set such that certain things can result, like life on Earth. So, but what is the actual evidence that we looked at it ourselves? Well, there's a few different types of fine-tuning. We can consider what's called cosmic fine-tuning or global fine-tuning. Now, don't think global like the globe or the Earth, but global like the whole universe, right? Everywhere that there is. And that would be the fine-tuning of constants and physical laws, which are applicable to the whole universe. And then the fine-tuning of the universe's initial conditions back when it supposedly began, right? So the initial conditions we think it had in order to produce, or it had to have had to produce the universe we have today, and the fine-tuning of the constants in physical laws, right? So if you think about a constant in a physical law, it's like gravity, right? The force of gravity equals the mass of one of the bodies times the mass of another one divided by the radius squared with that g in there. The g is the constant that has to kind of give that. That's not one of the constants we're going to use, but it's an example of a physical constant that does have to have a pretty fine value. So then there's planetary fine-tuning or like local fine-tuning related to the Earth. And that's kind of saying, the fine-tuning of galactic habitability. Basically, is our planet in such a place in the galaxy that it makes life possible? And then secondly, is our planet circumstellar, meaning around the star? Is our planet in the right place around the sun such that it also makes life possible? Okay, so let's look at cosmic constants. So here's just some coupling constants. These are kind of famous examples. And I've put all the 4 fundamental forces plus the cosmological constant that describes the universe's expansion. And then I've noted in parentheses some estimates that have been done of the odds, or not the odds, but the precision that needs to be maintained for these constants to make life possible, such that if you change any one of these, for example, the gravitational coupling constant by 1 in 10 to the 34, suddenly things would start to not quite happen. The gravitational coupling constant controls gravity in kind of a roundabout way, and so either planets would not form and they would kind of melt apart, or they'd be too gravitational, they would suck things into themselves and kind of collapse in on themselves. So these constants that are involved in life kind of have to have this precision that is unimaginable. When you think about the cosmological constant, needs to be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. It's like a 1 fraction bar, 1 with 120 zeros in the denominator. That is the amount of precision that if the cosmological constant did not maintain that precision, we would not have quite the universe's expansion that we do, and therefore it would make life hard because the universe would either fly apart or it would contract too quickly and it probably wouldn't have formed for more than a few seconds, things like that. So that's just kind of an example of some of the accuracy that has to be maintained with these numbers to get life as we know it. Scientists have looked into this. They've made ways to calculate it. I don't have time to go into that up here. But one kind of interesting thing is taking these ones that seem to be small, like 1 in 100, right? So it's like, okay, well, those kind of seem like, 1 in 100 is not that much. But if you consider them in combination, you get whoops, wrong button, you get that kind of a chart where we take the fine structure constant or the electromagnetic coupling one versus the strong nuclear force coupling constant, and we see that considered in combination, yeah, they may both be around 1 and 100 on each one axis, but considered as a two-dimensional space, we have areas where hydrogen can't form, chemical reactions are impossible, carbon and heavier elements cannot exist, and that little white sliver right there is where carbon-based life, aka us, is possible based on the values of just those two constants considered together, and that black X is where we are right now. Interestingly enough, though, if those constants had been off and it had been anywhere else in that grid, life as we know it would not be possible. Now, if we can consider the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, so not the constants of the universe, but the initial conditions, we get a similar picture. I'm going to focus on one, which is the initial low entropy distribution of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe. And the odds of this state that the Big Bang Theory would posit at the beginning of the universe, initial low entropy distribution of mass and energy, the chance of this occurring just kind of by itself, according to Roger Penrose, who's not a Christian, he's a physicist who actually last year won the Nobel Prize, so he's not nobody. He estimated that once at 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, which is just a mind-blowingly ununderstandable number. That was not a word, but you get the point. It's just an incomprehensible fraction of fine-tuning where it has to be that accurate. Otherwise, as Roger Penrose said, that's Roger Penrose, in order to produce a universe resembling the one in which we live, the creator would have to aim for an absurdly tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes. When he says the creator here, he's kind of speaking artfully. I actually did make sure to look it up, and he has claimed to be an atheist, or at least not believe in God. So there's that. Anyway, but if Roger Penrose, let's just say he's astronomically wrong, right? And we think, well, 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 1, that's just crazy. What if it's just 1 in like 10 to the 60, right? Well, that's still kind of astronomical because a lot of these calculations can be done. Haven't verified this. I found this in a source I used, but I kind of did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that this is in the ballpark at least. The accuracy of just 1 in 10 to the 60th is kind of like firing a bullet towards the other side of the universe, millions of light years away, and hitting a 1-inch radius target. Right, you're thinking just way out. You can't even see that far. Obviously, you can't even really. Nothing from Earth can actually even get that far. Physically, it's not possible right now. And so that's kind of just to put the number a little bit in perspective, and then say that's if Roger Penrose is off by a whole lot of orders of magnitude. We still have a really crazy amount of fine-tuning. So anyway, there's just kind of a overview of what's been done. If you want to go deeper, there's a lot of papers and books that kind of try to delve even deeper into the specific constants and different ways to consider those calculations and how they can be done and considered. Anyway, these two guys, Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez, wrote a book called The Privileged Planet, I believe, where they kind of argue for not the fine-tuning of the physical constants, but of more local conditions relating to the Earth itself. And they come up with these factors that in order to have life as we know it, carbon-based life with water and things that we need to survive, you need this list of things to be present on Earth. Steady plate tectonics, right amount of water, large moon with right planetary rotation period, proper concentration of sulfur, right planetary mass, inside the circumstellar habitable zone, meaning not too close to the sun or we'd burn up, not too far away from the sun or we would freeze. Low eccentricity orbit means our orbit needs to be mostly circular. It's not, it's actually elliptical, but it's close to circular. Some things have orbits that are really like oval shaped. So they get kind of, they speed up and slow down as they make it throughout their orbit, and that would be kind of not habitable. They explain why that would not be conducive to life. A large Jupiter mass planetary neighbor who might kind of collect some of the cosmic things that get thrown at the Earth, and since Jupiter is so massive and it's out far away from us, it kind of prevents us from getting hit by some of the space junk that's out there. We have to be outside the galaxy spiral arm to avoid being in contact with supernovae, which would make us not able to live on this planet. But we have to be within the galactic habitable zone. We can't be too close to the center of the galaxy because we get sucked into the black hole and we wouldn't survive. So there's just a number of considerations that the Earth has to meet in order to have even our form of life be possible. So they're just kind of trying to point out that it's unlikely that maybe this just is here because all of these little things are in place and all work the way they need to work in order for us to be here. So we have to consider now the next premise, and that's, is it physical necessity or chance? We propose that it might be physical necessity, chance, or design. And if we want to rule for design, we have to rule out physical necessity and chance. I'm going to provide kind of a few observations here. One, physical necessity would be speculation at best. Scientific evidence does not lead us to the conclusion that the constants of nature must be necessary. Using the scientific laws and varying the constants, we can explore other possible universes that aren't physically prohibited from existing, and we can kind of see how they react, and there's nothing within the physical laws that tells us the constants must have these values, and there's really no kind of, like Richard Feynman said, no reason why, nothing that tells us this has to be this value. And so to argue that this is all part of physical necessity is kind of hard-pressed on the evidence. And then constant initial conditions are not unique, and neither are our local planetary conditions. That would be even more hard to argue that it's kind of a physical necessity that our planet is the way it is, because there's a lot of other parts of the universe, other stars have planets that are not able to have life, and we know that, we've observed them. And so saying our condition locally here is necessary would even be more of a stretch than just saying that the constants of the universe are necessary. Chance, well, looking at all the different precisions that must be had and all the values that the constants could have, it is pretty low. So one, the universe conforms to an independent pattern, namely it's life-permitting, and the possible universes that are not life-permitting vastly outnumber those that are due to the wide array of finely tuned entities. Again, imagine that picture that had the different regions up there. Any point on that picture outside of that little white sliver, if you remember, was not suitable for life. And so the possible universes that are not life-permitting outnumber those, and so that we'd arrive at one of those if we just kind of the constants came to be by chance, also kind of unlikely. So if we've ruled out physical necessity and chance, well then maybe design, except that we get the objection, what about a multiverse? Probably one of the most common objections to this argument. I have, again, just kind of a few considerations to think about. Perhaps our universe is just one in a group of many universes that all have different values of the constants and a bunch of different stuff, and we just happen to be in the lucky one that has the right constants, and therefore we exist when there's a bunch of universes out there that don't have life. Maybe that's a possibility. And some models might suggest that that could mathematically be the case. We don't really have any evidence to support the actual existence of a multiverse. There's models that kind of imply that that might be possible, or models that say if it's considered in this way, then that could be a result. We don't actually have a way to really detect whether there's another universe. That's kind of hard, if not impossible. So there's not really any kind of direct, like we haven't observed the existence of a multiverse. We just have kind of theories and different mathematical models that might imply it. Occam's ratio would suggest that a designer is more plausible than multiple abstract theoretical entities required for a multiverse capable of altering physical constants to exist. Basically, in order for some of these models and theories to postulate a multiverse, there are certain abstract entities that need to be in place, such that is it more reasonable to postulate that there's one being named God that can kind of make it the way we need it, or that all these abstract entities are in place that allow multiverses to be generated, and therefore a bunch of different universes exist, and so all these things have to exist, and therefore we can avoid the argument, which is kind of saying, you know, Occam's razor, which one would be more plausible. Next, theories that propose the existence of multiverse generally require fine-tuning themselves. So, you know, for example, if you take like a string theory approach, which I'm not an expert at all, but string theory requires like more dimensions than the three that we live in, and the one time dimension. It has, I think, 11. That could be wrong, but I think at least some versions of string theory have 11. Well, why 11, right? Why couldn't it be 12 or mathematically 8 or, you know, whatever? So there are some parameters in these mathematical models that make a multiverse possible that themselves might require some sort of fine-tuning, or they seem to be constants that are just there. So what explains those constants if we take this step back, one step beyond universe to multiverse? And then finally, the Boltzmann brane problem, which says that if we're going to talk about many worlds or multiverses arising from, let's say, the collapse of a wave function, like I mentioned with the quantum cosmology slide, it's more likely for a single brain to kind of spontaneously form in the void with a false memory of existing in our universe than it is for an entire universe to come about the way it has over a long period of time to produce minds like ours that can think and can reason and actually observe reality as it is. It's actually more likely that the quantum wave function would have collapsed and produced a weird small universe that has a brain that is falsely loaded with these past memories, and that's more likely under this view that you're a Boltzmann brain and not actually yourself. Kind of an interesting, odd objection, but it's one that's proposed. So just some considerations with the multiverse question of could it have been a multiverse? It could have, but there's some problems that don't quite go away as well if we consider that hypothesis. So, oops, wrong button. Other fine-tuning objections, and there are other objections. I don't have time to go through each one and kind of catalog, but they do have responses. And if you want, you can look up the work of people who have responded to them. But there's objections like, you know, we can only observe the universe we live in. But that doesn't explain the universe we live in. It's just kind of an observation that, of course, we can only observe the universe we're in, but why is it the way it is? low probability events happen all the time, and of course they do. Actually, anytime you get dealt a hand of cards, that hand of cards that you got dealt is very unlikely that you would have gotten dealt that hand of cards. But the key question is that hand of cards maybe a royal flush that means something, that helps you win a game, right? Well, the question is, yeah, sure, any combination of the physical parameters is unlikely, but what about the very few ones that make life possible? That's kind of the winning the cosmic lottery, if you will want to put it that way. There can be other types of life forms. Yeah, that's been an objection. There are deeper laws of nature yet to be discovered that would explain these finely tuned constants. Could be, but we're kind of relying on something we don't know is there, and we don't know if it would actually explain all of them or not. Some of them might be rather unexplainable. Why is the universe so void and empty? If there's fine tuning, why is there all these places in the universe where there's, that's kind of a what could God have done, what should God have done if he actually fine tuned it, etc. objection. Since these constants are considered over an infinite range, they can't be normalized. Why does God need to fine tune? Can't he just make life in any universe? Another one. But I'm going to ask us to consider an interesting thought experiment that goes along with objections to the fine tuning argument, and this is the awesome theological argument proposed by a guy named Luke Barnes. He does a lot of work on fine tuning, so if you want to look up some of his papers and work, it's kind of interesting to read. He does a lot more of he's actually a cosmologist himself and does a lot of the scientific background that I don't have the expertise to do. But he proposes this little thought experiment called the awesome theological argument, and it goes like this. The stars in the sky spell out God exists and Jesus is God. If you need a visual, there's your visual. Took that picture myself. Obviously this is not the case. It's a parody. Okay, this is not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, it's due to design. And we kind of argue, he's taking fine tuning and making it just so overwhelmingly obvious, like still, trivially so, that it's like, well, okay, if the stars spelled out God exists and Jesus is God, might be good evidence to believe that God exists and Jesus is God. But then he thinks about, okay, well, what kind of objections could you put up against this argument? And he argues that a lot of the objections that you would put up against this argument are kind of parallel to ones that are made about the fine-tuning argument. And so he kind of proposes this interesting thought experiment called the comparison test. He says, if X is a good objection to the fine-tuning argument, then it's a good objection to the awesome theological argument. There are no good objections to the awesome theological argument. Therefore, there are no good objections to the fine-tuning argument. Interesting little thought experiment. I wouldn't take it as a tight, philosophically sound, this is an absolute argument that rules out any objections, but it's kind of interesting to see where some of these objections what they would be like if we applied them to this situation, and then kind of think about, how far do they cut and how much do they actually explain? Maybe we're just in, the multiverse where this is existing. But there's a bunch of multiverses where the stars wouldn't spell that out, so therefore that is not evidence of God's existence. Or, low probability events happen all the time, and so therefore, obviously, the stars spelling out anything is low probability, so why is it special that it spelled out this? Things like that. The arguments can always be parodied in a way that seems like the objections to the fine-tuning argument might cut a bit too far out of what we think we can infer from different finely adjusted properties. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that. I kind of thought that was interesting. Again, I'm not trying to say that this is some rigorous argument to say that there are no good objections, but more just kind of a way to consider the objections that are made and how far they go and what scope they have. So, okay. This is another type of teleological argument some people call it the intelligent design argument. Obviously, the previous one also argued for intelligent design. It's just kind of a nomenclature thing. It's arguing from the presence of information in DNA is what it is. So, let's look at that. 1, life contains substantial amounts of information, specified complexity, required for its existence, DNA. I'll explain that in a little bit. Premise 2, the only source that has ever been observed to produce this type of information is intelligence. Therefore, the best explanation of the existence of prior information in life is prior intelligence. Therefore, the information present in life is produced by a pre-existing intelligence, which we're calling God. Now, does life contain information? I think that it does. DNA is a molecule that exists in the cells of all living organisms, and you and me and any animals and bacteria and whatever you want to consider. It's highly structured and organized. There's kind of a pictorial of what DNA is structured like. DNA consists of a long chain of bases, which are specific molecules abbreviated as A, C, G, and T for adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. The DNA molecule is interpreted by the cells in our bodies to manufacture the proteins that our bodies need. The order of the bases is critical to determining the structure of proteins. So we can already see that there's an interpretation going on between what the DNA has, or what the order of the molecules it contains, and what the cell needs to survive. Common analogies that are used to describe DNA, you've probably heard some of these, are like it's like a language, or like a code, or a computer program, or a blueprint, or an instruction manual. All of these are indicative of some kind of an information containing thing, right? These ways that DNA is often described, because it is. In fact, here's the interpretation table for DNA. It has a triplet code, so you have, C, T, G that ends up being leucine, or G, A is, I think, glutamate. So like, there's actually a code, an interpretation table that can be made for how DNA is interpreted and used within the cells of our body to make proteins from these amino acids. Information, on the other hand, can be described as specified complexity. So something that is specified conforms to an externally defined pattern, such as like, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's very specified because it kind of conforms to this pattern that's repetitive. It looks kind of somewhat intelligible to us. It doesn't look like just random numbers thrown up on the board. There's something going on there, right? Something that exhibits complexity occurs with low probability, kind of like this nonsense statement. It has a complexity because it's a very low probability that you would just kind of draw some letters out of a bag and you'd have that statement. It's possible, but it's a very low probability event. Information contains the properties of both complexity and specification. So like this statement, 407 years ago, it's actually mathematically just as complex as the Nyen Yatwi Jilson mechanics thing up there, but it's also specified because it matches pre-existing structures of our language and its grammar and common words, right? So it kind of has both of these properties of something that is specified and complex. Therefore, it kind of has the moniker information. It's something that we can communicate with because it has both of these properties. So does life contain information? Well, connecting these two concepts, DNA possesses the probabilistic structure of information. It's complex, right? DNA's information has been shown by biology to be vitally useful. It's specified, meaning it can be interpreted and used. It conforms to a pattern that the cell uses to interpret it. Therefore, DNA is a type of meaningful information. It exhibits specified complexity. So whence cometh information? I kind of like that. Anyway, when we encounter these two properties of specification and complexity, it is natural to infer that design has taken place. For example, if we have Chimney Rock, now we could look at that and say, did anybody design Chimney Rock, or was it kind of like a process of erosion? Maybe there was some other kind of rock there that kind of eroded over time or something. But we can kind of say, okay, we named it Chimney Rock because, yeah, it kind of sort of looks like it might be a chimney, but obviously it doesn't really match, right? It's a very slight match. It's kind of like finding a cloud that looks like a rabbit or something like that, right? Not quite. But if we saw something like Mount Rushmore, we wouldn't have to sit here and question, oh, was that erosion that did that? Or because what are the two things it has? Well, one, it's kind of complex, right? All the little nooks and crannies of that design where they got the carvings and the mustache of Theodore Roosevelt and the noses and the eyes, a lot of complexity. It's also specified because this face pattern matches a human face, and much more than that, the face of a president, right? So we kind of look at that and we go, yes, we can infer that that is designed because it has these two properties. It's specified and it's complex. So this is also especially true in any type of language is involved, right? Not just like visual rock formations, but also like one of Adam's favorite examples is the movie Contact. If you've ever seen it, it's about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and they're looking for forms of life and intelligence that are outside of our planet, other places in the universe, and they start getting these signals that contain information. They start getting these signals that contain words and images and stuff that they can interpret and view, and right away they infer, oh, there must be intelligence outside our universe that is sending these signals. They don't have to pause and think, well, do these signals come from just, background radiation in the universe, and maybe they're not from intelligence? No, because they notice up to it, including a type of language coming from these signals from outer space, so then they infer we must be receiving the signals of intelligence that is somewhere out there. They don't have to kind of stop and think, well, maybe not. So that's just kind of a thing that when we encounter these two properties, specification and complexity, is reasonable to infer design. There's a guy named William Dembski who has proposed this mechanism called the explanatory filter. It's not like a, airtight, in all cases this can be used without any kind of exceptions, but in a general sense, it's kind of a nice flow chart. He says, is it something contingent, right? There are contingent versus necessary. If it's necessary, meaning it's not contingent, then it's a law. It's like a physical law or a law of nature that occurs with high probability, most likely probability 1, right? But if it's contingent, then is it complex? And if it's not complex, then probably could mean that it came from chance, right? Intermediate probability, it might have some unlikeliness, but it's not complex enough. But if it's complex, then is it specified? No, then it still could probably be chance, right? It's complex, like that nonsense string of characters we had earlier. That was complex, but it really didn't communicate anything to us. There was no pattern it was conforming to, so also it could probably just be due to chance if you drew a bunch of random letters out of a bag and then stuck them on the board. That's what it would look like. But if it's contingent, complex, and specified, it's likely we can infer that it had some element of design or purpose behind it. And so, taking into account both the fine-tuning argument about cosmological constants, or physical constants, I should say, being finely tuned, and this argument about DNA having information within all of our cells that kind of points to intelligence, we can kind of make a unified, if you will, teleological argument that goes something like this. Every design has a designer, premise one. Two, both the universe and life exhibit design. This kind of relies on the evidence we presented for the fine-tuning argument and for the DNA argument. Therefore, the universe and life have a designer, kind of a simple, well-to-remember, kind of unified form of the teleological argument, saying that when we encounter design in the world somewhere, in whatever form we find it, it is reasonable to conclude that design had to come from somebody who put it there, a designer who had an intention with it. So, final discussion question, which evidence of design do you find more compelling, the fine-tuning of the universe or the information in DNA, and why? again. Sorry to interrupt again, but we don't have much to go, and then afterwards, then we can talk as much as you want. But we've got one more segment to go, so. Okay, so if I was to give my personal opinion on this, probably I find the one in DNA slightly more compelling because I work with DNA in my graduate work, and I find that I intuitively understand that a bit better. I'm not a physicist, so some of the constants and how we get to where they're calculated out to be so unlikely is a bit theoretical sometimes, but that's just kind of a personal, because of the work I do. But anyway, I think both of them do present some compelling evidence regardless. So, okay, so let's kind of take a step back now that we've presented all of these arguments and think about where we're at. So other arguments that we did not cover tonight, but that do exist if you want to go explore them and kind of consider them, can include ones like the argument from beauty and the argument from the applicability of mathematics and the Christological argument and the argument from consciousness and the henological argument or the argument from degree, the argument from evil, an argument from intuition, and more. In fact, there's a whole book called 24 or so Arguments for God. I've not read it. It's very philosophically heavy, so I wouldn't start there if you're new to arguments for the existence of God, because I've read excerpts from it, and it's quite the thing. So, but there are even more arguments than the ones we talked about tonight. Some of them I like, some of them, not so much. But anyway, just kind of give you a little bit of a taste of what's out there beyond what we talked about tonight. So where are we? Well, with the cosmological arguments that we looked at, we kind of get that the universe had a cause for its beginning, or at least it is an explanation, if not a cause and a beginning, but most likely it also had a beginning. The universe has been fine-tuned for life. That's from our fine-tuning argument. And the universe has experienced infusions of information. And so we can kind of examine a few paradigms and kind of see, how do they hold up if we grant these three arguments are successful in establishing these three facts. Well, we can look at naturalism. Naturalism, not like nature, like I'm into nature, like John Muir was a naturalist, but naturalism is like only the material world exists. There's nothing outside the universe. There's no supernatural, just the natural world exists. That kind of naturalism really has a hard time explaining any of these, right? Because the universe can't cause itself, and so there's some kind of a cause that's external to the universe, and so if we're limited to only the things in the universe existing, an external cause is kind of ruled out. And also an external fine-tuner is kind of ruled out. It kind of has to be chance or physical necessity at that point if we're on naturalism. And then finally, that the universe has experienced infusions of information. If we've argued that natural processes usually don't produce the type of complex specificity that we observe, then naturalism kind of fails to explain these three facts. We can propose pantheism, but because pantheism proposes kind of a spiritual reality to the whole universe as a whole, that was redundant, the universe as a whole, or just kind of its God, if you will, is the universe, or it's coexistent with the universe. It kind of has a hard time accounting for facts 1 and 2, first you call them facts, but conclusions 1 and 2, because the universe can't cause itself, and you can't explain the cause of the universe from within itself, even if the universe is kind of given some deified state. It's kind of like the reverse of naturalism in a sense. The universe is all there is, but it has some kind of a spiritual essence to it, and so it has a hard time explaining at least 1 and 2, if not 3. And then if we propose like classical deism, right, the idea that there was a God who kind of showed up and got the whole thing going, created the universe, fine-tuned it, whatever you want to have, and then kind of walked away and didn't ever come back. That was kind of a view popular in like the 1700s at one point. That one, okay, might cover 1 and 2, kind of has a hard time with 3. You can kind of argue, well, maybe he had some way of, setting it up such that life would evolve later on, maybe. But it's kind of hard to kind of, without any involvement, without, DNA being placed in life, which appears on Earth, which we take the standard cosmological model, that's, billions of years after the Big Bang. So if there's some kind of a God who way back then supposedly started it and left, it's kind of hard to see how we get information unless it came about without his involvement, and we've kind of argued that that's unlikely. So that would also kind of rule out classical deism, which leaves us with classical theism that kind of nicely could account for all of these three conclusions that we've come to tonight through the different arguments that we proposed. So that's kind of an interesting thing if we consider other paradigms. They kind of have trouble explaining, all or parts of these conclusions, but theism seems to be an explanation that kind of gets the whole picture. So what have we learned so far about this God that we've been trying to argue exists, just from these arguments? Well, we can potentially infer from the moral argument this God might be personal, relational, probably morally good if he sets the standard, and loving if we consider that love is the foundation of morality, that we can kind of maybe infer that this God might be loving if he is the source and foundation of all morality. From the cosmological argument, we get that he's outside the universe, so probably spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, personal, powerful. We argue for all of those, personal again. From the teleological argument, we can get that he's kind of intelligent or knowledgeable, he's purposeful, creative even. And from the ontological argument, we're going to throw that one in. He's necessary and maximally great. He has the greatest, quantities of all these attributes. Sounds a lot like the God of the Bible, somewhat, actually. We've constructed a picture of God without really using the Bible. We kind of can infer, if these arguments are valid, that whoever this being is has these attributes, right? Personal, morally good, loving, spaceless, timeless, uncaused, powerful, intelligent, creative. And it's interesting that we got all of this. We didn't read the Bible to have it tell us this, but it's completely consistent with what the Bible does tell us about God if Christianity is true, that he would have these properties and more, actually. And so I think it's interesting when we consider like what Paul said in Acts 17. He said to the Athenians, he said, while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and all things in it, made for one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And Paul tells these Athenian philosophers, he says, look, you've at least realized that there is some deity out there. You've looked at the world and how it is and what constitutes it, and you said there seems that there has to be like a God. We just don't know who this God is. And Paul says, let me tell you who he is. In fact, he wanted you to find him. Like Paul also says in Romans 1, he says, that which is known about God is evident from within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, kind of two things that were in that list, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And again, Paul says, we can look at the world that is out there and kind of ascertain, who is this God that exists that I should maybe search for and perhaps find. And finally, I think that all of this comes down to what the psalmist said, David in Psalm 19, when he said this, as the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork, day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And so I think that that's true. And I haven't argued in tonight's talk that, the God of Christianity exists. I've just argued that there is a supreme being who has all these attributes. It's certainly possible, through some more argumentation that we might consider in the coming weeks, that the God of Christianity is the God who exists. But even so, just by looking at some of these arguments from nature and from the scientific and philosophical evidence, we can kind of conclude that a God, very much like the God of the Bible, seems to be implied, and therefore I think the heavens do in fact declare the glory of God. So that's what I got. Questions, I guess, if you want to stay longer, or you can just ask me later, or whatever you want to do. Does anybody have any burning questions? Feel free, or we can talk later, or just one-on-one, whatever you want to do, but it is kind of what time is it? It's 9:20, so didn't go till, what time were you out of the room by?
Technically 9:30, but
okay, so we won't rush you out, but yeah, we don't have it till midnight, obviously, so yeah, so I think we're good. So, all right, well, thanks for coming, and like I think there's a thing that Ben's doing. Have you announced that yet? Yes.
yep, game night and dinner at me and my house this Friday. So you come and help us out for dinner, park in the driveway, treats are plaza. Yeah, this will be a really good time.
All right.
Anytime after 5:30.
So see you next week.